The wolf trap snapped shut on nothing but air, and Glasha Ashwalker dropped the stick she had used to spring it before stepping around it in the gray morning light, moving with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had learned that the world set traps for creatures like her. She had been walking for 3 days through the pine-thick ridgeline east of Duskwall Creek, surviving on creek water and a strip of dried venison she had taken from a dead man's saddlebag, a man who had shot at her first and missed, and whose horse had thrown him at the sound of the gun. She had not killed him. She had checked his pulse, found it steady, and taken only the food. That mattered to her, though she doubted it would matter to anyone else in this part of the country. The Ashwalker clan had scattered 6 weeks ago, broken apart by a militia raid that swept down from Fort Calver in the dead of a winter night. Her cousin Dreva was dead. Her Aunt Eura was gone into the mountains. The elder, old Bograth, had told them all to run and not look back, and Glasha had obeyed because he was old and wise, and because the man holding a lantern over his head, while the militia burned their winter store, had been grinning, and she had understood in that moment that there was no reasoning with a grin like that. So she ran. She was 24 years old, which among orcs was something like the full bloom of a woman, and she carried herself like it even now, even ragged and cold. She wore travel leathers the color of dark pine bark, a fitted bodice laced tight up the front over a close-cut long-sleeved linen undershirt, her trousers tucked into knee-high boots with worn-down heels, a wide belt at her hips where she kept a bone-handled hunting knife. Her black hair was pulled back in a thick braid that had loosened over 3 days of travel and now trailed half-free around her jaw. Her skin was a deep olive green, smooth except for a small scar through her left brow, and the faint ritual lines tattooed along her collarbones, marks of her clan, marks she wore with quiet pride even now that her clan was ash and wind. She was beautiful in the way the frontier was beautiful, not gentle, not soft, but present and real and impossible to ignore. The first sign of the homestead was the smell of wood smoke, and Glasha stopped on the ridgeline and crouched in the scrub for a long time, watching. Below her, set back from a creek in a clearing that someone had cut out of the pines with considerable effort, was a single-room log cabin with a stone chimney, a small barn, and a kitchen garden enclosed in split-rail fencing. A woodpile taller than a man stood at the south side of the cabin. There was a lantern post near the barn, unlit in the morning. There were no other buildings in sight. No road. Just a wagon track that curled north through the trees and eventually, she supposed, reached whatever passed for civilization in this part of the territory. One person. She could see him from up here, a man working at the wood pile with an axe, splitting rounds in a steady rhythm that carried clearly in the cold air. He wore a worn canvas coat and a broad-brimmed hat and worked without hurrying, which told her something. Hurried men were nervous men, and nervous men shot at things they did not understand. She waited until her legs cramped from crouching. He never looked up. She was so hungry that her hands had begun to shake slightly, and the cold was settling into her lungs in a way that told her she might be getting sick. She had 2 choices: go down or keep walking north, where the elevation rose and the temperature dropped, and the nearest settlement was probably another 2 days on foot. Glasha Ashwalker was not a woman who chose death when there was another option. She came down the ridge slowly, making no effort to hide her approach once she cleared the tree line, because a person creeping toward a man with an axe tended to produce worse outcomes than a person walking openly. She kept her hands visible at her sides. He heard her when she was perhaps 30 yards out, and he stopped mid-swing and turned, and she saw his face for the first time. He was maybe 28, she thought, or somewhere close to it, a lean man with the kind of face that sunlight and wind had worked on honestly, not harshly, so that he looked weathered in a way that suited him rather than aging him. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly under his hat brim, and his eyes, when they met hers, were a particular shade of gray that she could only think of as the color of creek water in the shade. His jaw was unshaved, 3 or 4 days of dark stubble on it. He was not a large man, but he was not small either, the kind of build that came from actual work rather than from trying to look like anything in particular. He looked at her. She looked at him. The axe came down slowly until the head rested on the chopping block, and he straightened and pushed his hat back slightly on his head. He did not raise the axe. He did not reach for the rifle she could see leaning against the woodpile. He just looked at her the way a person looks at unexpected weather, with attention, not with alarm. "You are a long way from anywhere," he said. His voice was level, not unkind. "I am aware," Glasha said. Her voice was lower than most women's, with a slight rasp from the cold, and she kept her chin up, because she had learned early that looking down invited the kind of behavior that came from thinking someone was ashamed. He studied her for another moment. She watched him take in the braid coming loose, the travel-worn leathers, the way she was standing just slightly too still in the way that people stood when they were conserving the energy it would cost to shiver. "You hungry?" he said. She had expected several possible responses from a human man alone on a frontier homestead when an orc woman appeared out of the tree line. This was not one she had ranked highly in terms of probability. "Yes," she said, because there was no point in lying about it. He nodded as though she had confirmed something reasonable. "Come inside, then. I have got biscuits and salt pork, coffee if you want it." "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, because it seemed important to establish. "I did not think you were," he said, and he turned and walked toward the cabin door, and after a moment she followed him, because what else was there to do? His name was Simon Hawkins, and he told her so when he set a tin plate in front of her at a small table near the fire, along with a tin cup of coffee that was strong enough to stand a stick in. The cabin was a single-room bed along one wall, a stone fireplace, a table and 2 chairs, shelves of provisions along the back wall, and a work table with various tools and small repairs in progress. It smelled of pine resin and wood smoke and coffee, and the particular honest smell of a man who worked outdoors and did not try to disguise it with perfumes or powders. It smelled, Glasha thought with some faint surprise, like nothing dangerous at all. She ate. She ate with more control than she felt, because she was aware of him watching her from the corner of his eye the way polite people watch things they were curious about, and she would not let herself tear into the biscuits like a starving thing even though she was a starving thing. "How long have you been out there?" he asked, setting his own cup down across from her. 3 days on foot from the ridge country." "From the Ashwalker camp, the one the militia hit," he said it plainly, no judgment in either direction visible in his expression. She looked at him sharply. "You know about that. Word travels. I go into Duskwall twice a month for supplies. People talk." He turned his cup in his hands. "I heard the militia raided a clan camp east of the creek about 6 weeks back. Lost people on both sides from what I understand." "They lost 3, Glasha said evenly. "We lost 11, including a woman who was 60 years old and had not held a weapon in 20 years. He was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," he said, and she watched his face when he said it and decided he meant it, which was strange enough to be worth noting. "It was not your doing," she said. "No, but it happened anyway." He stood and refilled her coffee without asking, which she appreciated. "You are welcome to stay until you have your footing. The barn is warmer than it looks, and there is a loft with blankets, or the floor here if you prefer, closer to the fire." Glasha set her cup down and looked at him directly. "Why?" "Why what? Why would you offer that? You do not know me." Simon Hawkins looked at her with those Creekwater eyes, and there was something in his expression that was older than his age, some kind of settled quality, like a stone that had been in the river long enough to stop fighting the current. "Because you are cold and hungry and you have had a hard enough time already, from the look of it," he said. "And because I was raised by a woman who told me that the correct response to someone in need was to help them, not to examine their ancestry first." Glasha said nothing for a moment. "She sounds like she was a good woman," she said finally. "She was. She is gone now. Fever 6 years back." He said it without self-pity, just as fact. "Take the loft. There is extra firewood in the barn and a blanket chest at the top of the ladder. Sleep as long as you need." She did not say thank you in the way humans said it, as a single brief phrase. Among the Ashwalkers, gratitude was a serious thing, expressed through sustained presence and action. So she said, "I will split wood for you tomorrow," and he nodded like this was an entirely reasonable response, which told her something about him too. She slept for 14 hours in the barn loft, buried under 2 wool blankets with the smell of hay and horses and that same overarching quality of safeness that the whole property seemed to carry. And when she woke, she lay there for a while in the pale morning, trying to remember when she had last felt that. She could not remember, which was both sad and not sad at all, because she felt it now. She split wood until her arms burned, and he split wood beside her without making it a competition, and they fell into a rhythm naturally, alternating on the block. And by noon they had doubled the woodpile, and she felt more like herself than she had in 6 weeks. He made a midday meal of fried potatoes and the last of the salt pork, and they sat on the chopping block to eat it because the day had turned unexpectedly mild, and the sun came through the pines at a low angle that made everything look like it was made of brass. "You do not have neighbors," she observed. "Nearest homestead is 4 miles north. The Carver family, they are decent enough. Do they know about the raid?" "Yes. And they do not come to check on you. To warn you that there might be," she paused, "displaced Orc clan members in the area," his mouth curved slightly at the corner. "I expect they probably will eventually. Someone usually does. And when they do—" He looked at her. "I will tell them I have not seen anyone, or I will tell them the truth and tell them to mind their own business, depending on what kind of mood I am in when they arrive." Glasha looked at him for a long time. He did not fidget under the examination. "You are a strange man, Simon Hawkins," she said. "I have been told," he said, without sounding troubled by it. She stayed 3 days, and then she stayed 3 more, and then she stopped counting days the way you stop counting something that has become continuous rather than episodic. She was useful, and she knew how to be useful, which helped. She mended the fence on the east side of the kitchen garden, where the deer had pushed through it, and she tracked a young doe through the back acreage and brought it home over her shoulders without the rifle, which made Simon blink at her in a way that she found satisfying. She knew remedies for the cough that had settled into her chest, and she made a tea from willow bark and pine needles that burned it out within a week. She patched the corner of the cabin roof where the chinkling had cracked and the wind came through, working from the top of the woodpile as a ladder without asking for help, which he accepted. In return, he did not ask questions she did not volunteer answers to. He gave her the space on the floor by the fire without making it seem like a hardship on his part, and he kept her cup filled and the fire fed, and when she woke from a nightmare about Dreva's face, the way it had looked in the lantern light before the fire reached the stores, she would find that he had stoked the fire higher in the night without saying anything about it, as though he had simply noticed the room had gone cold and addressed it. It took her 2 weeks to realize she was watching him in the way that her grandmother had described, the watching that was not surveillance but attention, the kind of attention that was another word for something else. It happened on a Tuesday, or what she believed was Tuesday because he said it was Tuesday when he noted he needed to go to Duskwall at the end of the week. She was watching him repair a bridle at the work table, his long fingers working the awl through the leather with a patience that he brought to everything he did, and she realized she had stopped thinking about what she would do when she left. She was no longer planning to leave. She was not sure when that had happened. On Friday, he went to Duskwall. He asked her, without making a significant thing of it, whether she wanted to come or whether she would prefer to stay on the property. He said it in a way that told her he had thought carefully about which way to phrase it, because one phrasing would have sounded like he was embarrassed to be seen with her, and another would have sounded like he did not trust her to stay. "I will stay," she said, because she was not yet ready for Duskwall, and he nodded and left her with the property keys and the knowledge that he trusted her with them, which sat in her chest like a warm stone all day while he was gone. He came back at dusk with the wagon loaded with flour and salt and oil, and a small package wrapped in brown paper that he handed to her without ceremony when he came through the door. "What is this?" she said. "Open it." Inside was a small pot of tallow salve and a twist of dried chamomile and a length of dark green wool ribbon. She looked at them, then at him. "The salve is for your hands," he said, without meeting her eyes, looking instead at the provisions he was unloading. "I noticed they have been cracking from the cold. The chamomile is good in tea. The ribbon," he paused. "You mentioned your braid was coming apart. I do not know, I thought it might be useful." Glasha held the ribbon in her hands. She had not mentioned her braid to him. She had mentioned it to herself, pulling at it one morning, frustrated. He had been in the barn, which meant he had noticed without being told. "Simon," she said. He turned, and she could see in his expression that he was not sure how she would receive it, and that uncertainty made something in her chest do something that she recognized as significant. "Thank you," she said, and she said it in the human way, brief and clear, because she wanted him to hear it that way. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully, without the corner of mouth restraint he usually managed, and it changed his face completely, made it younger, made those gray eyes go warm in a way that she felt in her stomach. "You are welcome," he said, and went back to his unloading, and Glasha stood in the cabin doorway holding a green ribbon and a pot of salve and felt the world shifting very slowly beneath her feet, like ice in spring. The trouble came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into her stay. It arrived in the form of 2 men on horseback coming down the wagon track. A large, thick-shouldered man named Aldous Carver, who was Simon's nearest neighbor, and behind him, a younger man with a militia badge pinned to his coat that was still bright and new-looking, which meant he wore it with pride rather than habit. The young man's name was Torvin Stout, and he was the son of the Duskwall sheriff, which Glasha worked out from context within the first minute of their arrival. She was in the kitchen garden when they rode in, and she made no move to hide, because hiding would have looked like guilt and she had done nothing to be guilty of. She stood with her hands on the fence rail and watched them pull up in the yard. Simon came out of the barn when he heard the horses. "Aldous," he said, nodding. He looked at the badge. "Torvin." "Simon." Aldous Carver was a man who had the look of someone who had decided things about the world a long time ago and did not intend to revise them. His eyes found Glasha immediately, and his expression did the thing that expressions did when they tried to be neutral and failed. "Got word there might be Ashwalker clan in the area after the militia action last month." "I heard the same," Simon said. "Stout here is riding the properties. Official inquiry like." Aldous said it with the particular comfort of a man who liked the word official. Torvin Stout rode his horse a step forward and looked at Glasha with the specific expression of a young man with a badge and insufficient wisdom. "That your orc?" he said, addressing Simon. The phrase landed in the air between all of them like a dropped stone. Glasha watched Simon's jaw go very slightly tight beneath his stubble. "She is not my anything," Simon said, his voice still level. "She is a person staying on my property with my invitation, which is entirely within my rights as the property holder. The inquiry is about displaced Ashwalker clan members who might present what?" Simon said. The levelness in his voice had developed an edge, the way ice develops an edge at a thaw. "Finish the sentence, Torvin." "A what?" Torvin Stout had the grace to falter slightly. "A risk," he said, but it came out smaller than he'd intended. "She has been on this property for 3 weeks, Simon said, splitting wood and mending fences and doing no harm to anyone. If that presents a risk to the territory, I am at a loss to identify what the nature of that risk might be." He looked at Aldous. "Is there a warrant?" "No warrant," Aldous said, with the slight deflation of a man who had been the most powerful person in most conversations for a long time and was currently not. "Just the inquiry." "Then the inquiry is finished," Simon said. "She stays. If a warrant appears, I will address it at that time with appropriate legal counsel. Good day, Aldous." Torvin. He did not move. He stood in his yard between the 2 men on horseback and the woman at his fence, and he did not shift his weight or look away, And after a moment, Aldous Carver turned his horse and Torvin Stout followed, and they went back up the wagon track. Glasha watched them go. Then she looked at Simon. He was still looking after the horses, and she could see the tension in his shoulders beginning to ease, releasing from somewhere high and tight, and when he turned to face her his expression was something between apology and determination. "I am sorry about that," he said. "You did not do it," she said. "No, but they will be back and they will not always be without a warrant." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "You did not have to do that. You could have let them take me in for inquiry and it would have been easier for you." "Easier is not the same as right," he said, with a simplicity that knocked the breath out of her chest. She looked at him for a long moment, this lean, quiet man with his gray eyes and his cracked leather hands and his stubborn, unbothered sense of what was decent, and she said, without having planned to say it, "You smell like safety." The words came out of her in the Ashwalker dialect, and then, immediately after in the common tongue, because she said them without thinking, and then realized what she had said and translated out of instinct. He blinked. "I beg your pardon." She looked away, suddenly, inexplicably, warmer in the face than she had any right to be. It is something that is said, among my people, an observation." "What does it mean, when your people say it?" She was quiet for long enough that he might have left it alone, but he waited, and she had noticed that he always waited. "It means," she said carefully, "that a person's scent is that it carries the quality of—" She stopped, because the Ashwalker concept was nuanced and the common tongue was blunt as an axe. "Among my people, scent is significant. It is communication, in a way humans do not quite have the sensitivity for. When we say that someone smells like safety, we mean that their presence, their particular quality of being, tells our instinct that we are in no danger with them, that they are trustworthy, that they are—" She hesitated. "That they are the kind of person you build things with." The silence stretched between them like a bridge being tested. "Build things with," Simon repeated slowly. "Yes," Glasha said, looking at the fence post rather than at him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Well," he said. That is a real kind thing to say." He went back into the barn, and Glasha returned to the garden, and neither of them said anything else about it for several days. But something had changed in the air between them, the way weather changes before a storm, not threatening, but charged and full of something coming. What she had not told him, because she had only remembered it after the words were already out of her mouth, was that among the Ashwalkers, saying someone smelled like safety was not merely an observation. It was a proposal. The phrase had been used this way in her clan for as long as anyone could remember. It was not done formally, not announced. You said it and you knew what you meant, and if the other person eventually understood and answered in kind, you were bound. It was the beginning of the thing, not the middle or the end, but it was the beginning in the most serious sense. She lay in her blankets by the fire that night and thought about this. She had not meant to propose to Simon Hawkins. She had meant to say something true. The fact that in her tradition those two things were the same thing was a complication she had not anticipated. She was not certain she regretted it. October came in hard, and the nights dropped below freezing, and the work of the homestead shifted toward preparation, storing the last of the root vegetables, banking the base of the cabin walls with earth and packed straw, bringing the horses into the barn at night. Glasha worked alongside Simon so naturally now that they had developed a kind of wordless coordination, the kind that takes months to build between any two people and usually requires a shared house and a shared life. They had both, as it turned out. On a Friday evening in the second week of October, Simon came in from the barn to find Glasha at the worktable studying a map he had pinned to the wall, a rough hand-drawn survey of the territory north of Duskwall, marking elevations and creek lines. "My aunt went north," she said, without turning. "Into the high country. I am trying to work out where she might have gone. Ura." He said her name without stumbling on it, because Glasha had mentioned Ura once and he had filed the name carefully and used it correctly ever since. "Yes, if she is still alive, she is somewhere in the pine flats above the creek forks, maybe 12 miles northeast from here. I know that country somewhat. He came to stand beside her at the map, close enough that their arms nearly touched. There is a cave system along the north face of Bitter Ridge. Used to be a trapper's line camp up there maybe 20 years back, abandoned now. It would be defensible with a south-facing entrance that gets some sun. Glasha traced the ridge line on the map with her finger. Here, near enough, he paused. Do you want to go look for her? She turned to look at him. He was very close, and in the firelight his eyes had gone from gray to something warmer. It could be dangerous, she said, if there are still militia patrols in the high country. There are not this time of year. Too cold and too far from anything they care about. He said it with the easy authority of a man who had learned the territory on its own terms. I know the route. I can get us there in a day and a half, the word us. It was so casually said, so entirely without drama, that it arrived in her chest like something she had not known she was waiting for. You would go with me, she said. Of course, he said, in a tone that suggested he was slightly puzzled by the question. They left on Sunday at first light, when the sky was still dark blue at the horizon, and the stars were just beginning to concede the east. Simon loaded the pack horse with provisions and extra blankets, a rifle, and 2 days of firewood in bundles, because the high country this late in October had opinions about fire, and he believed in being prepared. Glasha carried her hunting knife and a small coil of rope, and the knowledge of these mountains in her blood, the kind of knowledge that came from growing up in country like this, even if the specific mountain was new to her. They rode north through the pines, and the day opened cold and pale around them, and Glasha found herself deeply content in a way that she examined with some suspicion before concluding it was simply genuine. Simon was good company on the trail in the way that some people were naturally good company in wilderness. He did not fill silence that did not need filling. He pointed out things of interest without lecturing about them, and he had the particular skill of making a difficult trail feel manageable by maintaining a steady pace and a steady disposition throughout. Tell me about Yura, he said, at one point when they had found a level stretch and could ride abreast. She is my mother's sister. She is 49. She was the healer of the Ashwalkers for 20 years. She knows every plant on the ridge that can either kill you or cure you, and a considerable number that can do both. Glasha considered. She is the person I would most want beside me in a bad situation. She is also the most infuriating person I have ever known because she has a habit of being right about things before you are ready to hear it. Simon smiled. She sounds like my mother. Was your mother an orc? He laughed, actually laughed. Not a polite sound, but a real one, and the warmth of it went through her like good food. She was not. She was a farmer's daughter from the valley country, very small, very fierce. She could read a person the way you read a trail, you know, just looking, just watching, and then she knew. My grandmother was like that, Glasha said. She said the body tells the truth that the words hide. She used to embarrass everyone by simply describing what they actually felt as opposed to what they claimed to feel. That sounds mortifying, Simon said with feeling. It was. She smiled, which felt different on her face than it used to, easier, less like a decision and more like a reflex. They found the cave system in the late afternoon of the second day, and they found Yura in it. She was alive. She was thin and frostbitten on her left toes, and she had the beginning of a chest infection. But she was alive and coherent and sitting in the back of the cave by a small fire with a sharpened stick across her knees like she had been waiting for trouble and intended to address it. When she saw Glasha, she made a sound that Glasha had not heard from another orc in 6 weeks. A sound that had no good translation, but that meant something like, finally. You are here. I was beginning to lose patience. Glasha crossed the cave in 4 strides and wrapped her arms around her aunt and held on, and Yura held on back, and neither of them said anything for a long time. When they separated, Yura looked past Glasha's shoulder at Simon, who was standing at the cave entrance in a way that suggested he was making a deliberate effort not to intrude. Who is this? Yura said, in the common tongue, because she had always been careful to speak the common tongue in mixed company, which she said was a courtesy that cost nothing and built more than most things. "Simon Hawkins," Glasha said. "He is the one whose land I have been staying on." Yura studied him with an expression that Glasha recognized as the full deployment of her grandmother's skill. "He came to help you find me," Yura said. "It was not a question." "Yes." Yura looked at him a moment longer. Then she looked at Glasha, and her expression did something complex, and knowing that Glasha did not entirely appreciate being on the receiving end of, especially in present company. "You smell like her," Yura said to Simon in the common tongue, deliberately and clearly. Glasha felt her face go warm. Simon, who did not know what this meant, simply looked politely curious. "I beg your pardon. He does not know what that means," Glasha said quickly, and in Ashwalker she said to her aunt, "Do not." Yura's expression was the expression of a woman who was going to, absolutely, at some point. They made camp in the cave that night, the three of them, with a proper fire and the provisions Simon had brought, and Yura ate as though she were making up for 2 weeks of inadequate meals, which she was, and color came back to her face with the warmth. Glasha checked her frostbite with the same care Yura had always shown others, and they talked in low voices while Simon sat across the fire cleaning the rifle and listening without appearing to listen. "He is a good man," Yura said, in Ashwalker watching Glasha work. "I know," Glasha said. "You said the words," a pause, "accidentally." Yura's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed, "accidentally. I did not intend to say them. I said them because they were true, and then I remembered what they meant." "Does he know what they meant?" "No, I told him it was a compliment." Yura was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that what you want it to be? Only a compliment?" Glasha wrapped her aunt's toes in the last of the clean linen and did not answer, because the answer was perfectly obvious and she was not ready to say it aloud. They came back down from the mountains 3 days later with Yura between them on the pack horse, and when they arrived at the homestead, it was raining. A cold, steady October rain that turned the yard to mud and made the cabin firelight look twice as warm from outside. Simon made space. He did it without discussion or complaint, rigging a second sleeping area by the fire for Yura with the same practical calm with which he had simply extended his home to Glasha 3 weeks ago. And he brought out extra blankets and made a broth that Yura declared to be better medicine than anything she had in her kit, which he accepted with the quiet embarrassment of a man who did not entirely know how to take a compliment. The days shortened and the temperature dropped, and the three of them settled into a rhythm on the homestead that Glasha would have called domestic, if that word had not felt so significant, so intended. Simon repaired the barn roof, while Glasha and Yura restocked the medicine supply from what they could find in the late-season woods. Yura made an ointment for Simon's cracked knuckles that he applied conscientiously every night, which Yura told Glasha, privately and with apparent satisfaction, was a man who listened to instructions, which was rare and worth noting. One evening at the end of October, Glasha came inside from banking the last of the kitchen garden beds against the frost to find Simon and Yura sitting across from each other at the table, not talking, just sitting in the comfortable way that people who have arrived at a mutual understanding sit. Simon had his hands around his coffee cup. Yura had hers around a tea that smelled of chamomile. "She was telling me about your grandmother," Simon said when Glasha came in. "My grandmother would have lectured you for 20 minutes about the virtues of getting enough sleep," Glasha said, unwinding her scarf. "She sounds formidable," Simon said. She was. She could make grown men feel like they had not done enough with their lives through a single sustained look. "I know the feeling," Simon said, glancing briefly at Yura. Yura smiled into her tea. That night the first real snow fell, not a dusting but a committed, serious snowfall that changed the quality of the dark outside the window and the sound of the wind. And when Glasha woke in the small hours, the fire had burned low, and the cabin had gone cold enough that her breath was visible. She got up to feed the fire, and she found Simon already awake, crouched at the hearth adding wood, and they both froze in the same moment, close together in the firelight with the snow coming down outside and the world gone quiet with it. "Sorry," he said, quietly enough not to wake Yura. "I did not mean to startle you." "You did not," she said, also quietly. She was close enough to him to feel the warmth that he carried even in a cold room, and she remembered what she had said to him, "You smell like safety," and she understood again in her body rather than in her mind exactly why she had said it. He looked at her. The fire was casting moving light across his face, and his gray eyes were dark in it. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question was soft, not perfunctory, not social. He actually wanted to know. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to things. "I am better than I have been in a long time," he said, and the honesty of it was so undecorated that it went straight through her. "So am I," she said. They stayed there by the fire for a long time, not talking, not touching, both of them aware of something that had no name yet but was building between them like the snow was building outside, quietly, without hurry, with the patient certainty of a thing that had decided to accumulate. November came, and with it, a different kind of trouble. A man named Garrett Solis arrived at the homestead one morning, a lean, hard-faced man of about 50 in a coat with a territorial authority badge that was older and more worn than Torvin Stout's, which meant it was more dangerous. He came alone, which was either confident or calculating. He was polite. That was the part that required the most careful attention. The men who were impolite were easier to manage because their intentions were visible. Garrett Solis was polite the way a closing trap was neat. He had papers. He laid them on Simon's table without being invited in, because he was the kind of man who laid papers on tables and waited for other people to feel the weight of them. The papers were a territorial relocation order, a directive from the Calver Authority requiring displaced Ashwalker clan members to register with the garrison or face formal settlement in one of the designated holding camps to the south. The language was bureaucratic, and beneath the bureaucratic language was the simpler language of, "You do not belong here, and we have written that down in sufficient copies." Glasha read the papers. Then Yura read them. Yura's expression was a controlled thing, but Glasha knew her aunt's face and she could see the anger moving behind it like water under ice. "She has committed no crime," Simon said. He was standing at the far side of the table, and his voice was the level voice that Glasha now understood was not calm, but was rather what he sounded like when he was choosing his words with exceptional care. "The order does not require criminal offense," Solis said pleasantly. "It is a relocation directive for unregistered non-human persons within the territory boundaries. She is on my property, with my invitation. The directive applies regardless of property circumstances. The territorial authority has. I would like to see the legal instrument that grants the territorial authority standing over privately held property," Simon said. "Specifically the section that would allow a relocation order to supersede a property holder's rights under the Frontier Settlement Act." Solis blinked. He had not expected that. "I am not a lawyer," Simon said, "but I have had occasion to read the Settlement Act, and I am fairly certain that the provision you are operating under was applied to unhoused persons, not to persons with established residence on deeded property." Solis recovered. "The act applies to non-citizens of the territory, regardless of residence." "Then the question is citizenship status, not residence status," Simon said. "And that is a question I would like answered in writing, through the proper legal channels before anyone goes anywhere." He met Solis's eyes. "I am not being uncooperative. I am asking that the law be applied correctly, which should be something we both want, I would think." Solis looked at him for a moment, then at Glasha, then back. "I will return," he said, gathering his papers, "with clarification from the garrison." "I look forward to it," Simon said pleasantly. Solis left. Simon turned from the door, and Glasha could see the effort it cost him to maintain the level expression. There was a faint set to his jaw and a tightness in his hands that he was working through. "That will not hold him indefinitely," she said. "No," he agreed. But it will hold him long enough for me to write to a man I know in the territorial capital who practiced law before he retired to the country. He owes me a letter, and I intend to collect. He looked at her. I'm not going to let them take you, Glasha. She heard the simplicity of it, the way he said it, not I will try or I will do what I can, but I am not going to let them take you, stated like a fact about the weather. You do not have to fight my battles, she said. It is not your battle, he said. It is mine. They are on my property, trying to tell me who I can and cannot invite to stay here, and that is a problem I have opinions about regardless of who is involved. Yura, from her corner, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but contained all the satisfaction of one. Simon wrote the letter that evening, and Glasha sat across the table from him while he wrote, watching his hand move across the paper in a careful, unhurried script, and she thought about how strange it was to be cared for by someone who did not consider it a burden. She had been raised in a clan, surrounded by people who cared for each other, but that had been mutual and communal, everyone carrying everyone else because that was how you survived. This was different. This was a single human man, with no obligation to her, choosing to put himself between her and the machinery of a government that did not consider her a full person, and doing it with the same practical calm with which he split wood or mended bridles. She thought about the words she had said without meaning to say them. She thought about what they meant. She thought about what she wanted them to mean. The letter went north with the next mail rider, and they waited. December came slowly, the way December comes in mountain country, first as a tightening of the cold, then as the first permanent snow on the upper ridges, and then as the long, dark, settled quality of a winter that intends to be serious about itself. On the 20th of December, Garrett Solly's returned, and this time he had Torvin Stout with him and 2 additional militiamen and a second set of papers. They came at mid-morning, when Simon was in the barn and Glasha and Yura were in the yard cutting through the frozen crust of the kitchen garden to harvest the last of the turnips, which were tougher than most things and survived cold that would kill anything with softer ambitions. Glasha heard the horses first. She heard most things first, which was simply how her senses worked, and she straightened and turned, and Yura looked up too. 4 men on horseback coming down the wagon track. Glasha set the spade in the frozen ground and stood straight, and she did not move, and she did not look away. Solly's dismounted. He had the comfortable authority of a man with papers in his coat and soldiers at his back. Glasha Ashwalker, he said formally, using her name with the precise diction of official language, and he looked at Yura Ashwalker. By order of the Calver Territorial Authority, what is going on here? Simon came out of the barn fast, not running but moving with a purpose that covered ground quickly. He had his coat but not his hat, which meant he had heard the horses and come immediately, and there was a quality in his face that Glasha had not seen before, not anger exactly, but something below anger, something foundational. "Mr. Hawkins," Solly said, adjusting. "We have an updated order from the garrison, issued in response to legal inquiry." "Give it to me," Simon said, and held his hand out. Solly's gave him the papers. Simon read them, and Glasha watched him read them, and she watched the moment when he reached whatever the relevant section was, because his jaw tightened in a way that was very specific. "This cites a territorial statute that was repealed 14 months ago," Simon said. Solly's blinked. "That cannot, Statute 41, subsection 9, Frontier Persons Relocation Act. Repealed by the Territorial Assembly in the spring of last year, following legal challenge." He held the papers out. "The man I wrote to was a lawyer in the Assembly for 20 years, Mr. Solly's. He was kind enough to send me a very thorough response." He reached into his own coat and produced a folded letter which he extended alongside the papers. "You will find the relevant documentation within." The militiamen looked at each other. Torvin Stout looked like he was reconsidering several life choices simultaneously. Solly's took the letter. He read it. He read it again. "Even so," Solly said, and the pleasantness was still there but strained now, like good leather being pulled too hard. Even so, the authority has grounds under general settlement provisions. Under general settlement provisions, Simon said, a property holder has the right to designate residents of his property. Both of these women have been designated as such in writing, which I have filed with the Duskwall Record Office. He reached into his coat again and produced a second document, registered 3 weeks ago, which predates your updated order. The yard was very still. The militia men had the look of men who had come expecting a manageable situation and had arrived at a legal argument which was considerably more inconvenient. "You planned for this," Glasha said, quietly, so only Simon could hear. "Since November," he murmured back, not looking away from Solly's. He had planned for it since November, since shortly after Solly's first visit. He had quietly, methodically, with the same patience he brought to everything, built a legal wall around her and Yura and their right to stay. Solly's folded his papers. He looked at Simon for a long moment, and in the look was a complicated mix of assessment and something that might, if she was generous, have been a grudging recalibration. "This will not be the end of the inquiry," Solly said. "I expect not," Simon agreed. "But until the law changes, which it may, I expect we will continue to have a legal right to be here. Have a good day, Mr. Solly's." He waited until all 4 horses were back up the wagon track before he let out a breath that he had apparently been holding since he came out of the barn. Glasha looked at him. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "Are you?" "I am getting there," he said, and she saw the steadying of him, the deliberate pulling together that he did when things had been difficult. Without thinking, without the hesitation that had kept her hands to herself for months, she reached out and took his hand. Not grasping, not clutching, just her fingers closing over his, a simple and certain contact that said everything it needed to say and nothing more. He went very still for a moment. Then his hand closed around hers, and he held on. They stood like that in the cold yard, in the winter light, with the turnips still half-harvested, and the boot tracks of 4 militia men beginning to fill with fresh snow. And Yura watched from the kitchen garden with the expression of a woman who had known this was coming for some time and was deeply, privately satisfied to have it confirmed. That evening, after supper, after Yura had gone to her corner with her tea and her book, Glasha and Simon sat by the fire with the settled quiet of people who have passed through something together and come out on the other side still holding the thread. "Simon," she said, "yes. I need to tell you what I actually meant when I said you smelled like safety." The fire crackled. He set his cup down and gave her his full attention the way he always did. She told him. She told him about the phrase and its meaning in Ashwalker tradition, the full meaning, not the abbreviated version she had offered before. She told him about the way it functioned as a beginning, not merely an observation. She told him about what it meant for it to be said and meant. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the silence was the particular kind of silence that meant someone was thinking seriously. "You said it accidentally," he said finally. "Yes, but you did not unsay it." She met his eyes. "No, why not?" "Because it was true," she said, "and because she paused, I am not sorry that it was true." He looked at her for a long time. The firelight moved over his face, and she watched him arrive at something. She could see it in the gray of his eyes, a decision that had been building for a long time finally reaching its conclusion. "I do not know your tradition well enough to say the right words back," he said. "I would not want to say them wrong." He leaned forward slightly, closing some of the distance between them. "But if it means that you are the person I want to build things with, that you are the person whose presence in my home has made it feel like a home in a way it has not for a long time, that you are the person whose opinion I want in the morning and whose face I look for when I come inside, then tell me the right words and I will say them." "The right words," she said carefully, "are, 'You carry my peace.'" He said them. He said them in the Ashwalker way she had heard them said, without stumbling, with the straightforward sincerity that was the most important part. She felt it in every part of her. "That means yes," he said. "That means yes," she said. He reached across the space between them and touched her face, just his hand against her jaw, careful and warm, and she turned her face into it the way a person turns toward light. And when he kissed her, it was slow and deliberate and utterly unsurprised, as though they had both been waiting to arrive here and were simply glad to have arrived. Behind them, from the corner, Yura made the satisfied sound of a woman who had been right about something for quite some time. "I am still in the room," Yura said with dignity. "We know," Simon and Glasha said simultaneously, and the laughter that broke between them felt like the beginning of everything. Winter passed the way good winters pass slowly, and with a quality of deep interior warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. They worked together on the homestead through the cold months, hauling water from the spring before it froze over in the mornings, keeping the barn animals fed and warm, preserving the last of the autumn provisions, repairing the things that winter had a habit of breaking. Yura healed fully, her toes recovering with careful tending and her chest clearing out with her own remedies, applied with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who had no intention of dying of something manageable. The evenings were long, and they used them the way people use long evenings on a frontier homestead when they have chosen each other, talking, learning, finding the shape of one another's minds. Simon had opinions about land and weather, and the settlement of the territory that were specific and interesting. Glasha had knowledge about plants and animals, and the movement of seasons through the ridgeline country that was precise and deep. Yura had opinions about everything and shared them freely, which they both valued even when they would rather she did not. He told her about his childhood in the valley country, where his father had tried farming river-bottom land that had flooded 2 years in 3, and had finally sold the lease and moved the family north to try something colder and harder and more honest. He told her about learning to read from his mother in the cabin that was only slightly larger than this one, by firelight, from the 2 books she had brought with her in the wagon. He told her about the years after her death when the homestead had been something he maintained rather than something he lived in, going through the motions of the life she had wanted for him without being particularly inside it. And now, she said one evening, in the deep winter, lying side by side on the narrow bed, because the floor was simply too cold, and they had reached the point weeks ago where proximity had become natural and necessary rather than fraught. "Now," he said, staring at the ceiling with her head on his shoulder and her braid loose against his collarbone, "it is a home again." She pressed her face into the warmth of his neck and breathed him in pine and wood smoke and leather and that particular quality that she had no name for in the common tongue, only in her own the safety quality, the build things with quality, and she felt so intensely, so completely, that she held very still with it, afraid to disturb it. "You are going to have a crick in your neck from holding so still," he observed. She laughed despite herself. "How do you know when I am holding still?" "You breathe differently," he said. "When you are thinking something significant, you breathe very slowly. It has been a useful indicator. That is alarming." "I have no nefarious use for the information," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. She tilted her head up and kissed him, unhurried, and he kissed her back, and the warmth between them built slowly into something that was not just warmth anymore, something tender and certain and deeply felt. The kind of closeness that was not urgency but was its own kind of permanence. When they came together for the first time, it was on a night in February when the storm outside was so complete that the world beyond the cabin walls had ceased to exist in any practical sense. And it was with the slowness and the care of 2 people who had been patient about everything and were still patient even now, even in this learning each other with the same thoroughness they brought to everything. The way you learn a new country, with attention and without hurry. It was warm and real and deep in a way that Glasha had not known to want and now could not imagine being without. And when it was finished, they lay tangled together in the firelight while the storm spoke outside, and it felt, she thought, like something that had been decided by something larger than either of them, in the way the mountains had been decided before either of them had arrived, but waiting for them specifically. "You smell like safety," she told him quietly against his skin. "And you carry my peace," he said just as quietly. Outside, the storm continued to state its case, and neither of them was listening. Spring came the way spring comes to ridge country, all at once and immediately seriously, the snow retreating uphill in broad swift bands, the creek running hard with snowmelt, the woods going from brown silence to a green and vocal place almost overnight. The kitchen garden needed to be broken and turned and replanted, and the cabin roof needed attention from the winter, and the fence on the north side had been pushed again by deer or perhaps by the bear whose tracks Simon found along the creek in March. Yura made a decision in April. She came to them both one evening after supper with the particular expression she wore when she had already made up her mind and was informing rather than consulting. "There are other Ashwalkers in the high country," she said. "I have been in contact this winter through the trader who comes down from the North Pass." She looked at Glasha. "Bograth is alive. He is in the mountains with 11 others. They are surviving, but they are not well. They need a healer." Glasha straightened. "Yura, I am going," her aunt said simply. "I have been well since February, and I have been using the time to prepare. I have a pack ready. I leave at the end of the week." She paused. "This is not your responsibility to manage. It is mine. This is what I am for." Glasha wanted to argue and found that she could not, because Yura was right. This was what she was for, and Yura had always known what she was for and pursued it without apology. "I will go with you as far as the North Pass," Glasha said. "I know," Yura said, as though this had already been decided. Simon was quiet through this exchange, and when it was done he looked at Yura with a directness that contained everything he did not say. "What do you need?" "Provisions," Yura said. "A good pack horse if you can spare one." And she paused, and something in her expression shifted from practical to personal. "Your word that you will take care of her." "You have had that since November," he said. Yura looked at him for a long time with the grandmother look, the look that read the body's truth beneath the words. Then she said to Glasha in Ashwalker, "He means it completely." "I know," Glasha said. "Good," Yura said, and went back to packing. The parting at the North Pass was early and cold, in a gray dawn with the pass above them lost in cloud, and the track Yura intended to take visible for perhaps a quarter-mile before the pines swallowed it. Glasha held her aunt for a long time, and Yura held her back with the grip of a woman who was not sentimental but believed in thoroughness. "You found something extraordinary," Yura said quietly into Glasha's ear. "Keep it." "I intend to," Glasha said. Yura stepped back and looked at Simon, who was holding the pack horse's lead with his hat in his hand. "You are a good man, Simon Hawkins," she said. "I am trying to be," he said. "You are not trying," Yura said. "You simply are." "There is a difference." She took the pack horse's lead from him. "Take care of the property. The south garden bed needs an additional layer of compost before you plant the root vegetables, or you will have poor yields. The corner of the barn with the cracked foundation will need addressing before next winter." She looked at Glasha one final time. "Be happy. It is not a small thing." She turned and walked into the pines with the pack horse, and she did not look back, and they watched until she was gone. Glasha stood in the pass with the mountain wind in her face and felt the space left by her aunt's departure, felt it as a real and specific thing, a kind of ache that was also love. Simon stood beside her, and after a moment his hand found hers, and they stood like that until the wind from the upper pass reminded them that standing still in a mountain gap in spring was not advisable. "She will be all right," he said. "She is formidable." "She is the most formidable person I have ever met," Glasha said, "and I have met some formidable people." "Including yourself," he said. She looked at him. "Including yourself," he said again, meeting her eyes without apology. She decided, standing on that wind-draped pass, that she had never been quite so known by another person, and that it was the best feeling she had ever encountered in 24 years of being alive in a world that had spent considerable energy trying to make her feel otherwise. She kissed him there in the wind, on the mountain, with nobody watching except the pines. Summer at the homestead was the first summer Glasha had been still in years. She had spent her adult life moving with the Ashwalker clan, seasonal migrations following the game and the weather, the constant low-level alertness that came with being people who were never quite safe in one place for too long. The idea of a summer spent in one location, watching things grow, had been abstract to her in a pleasant way. The reality of it was better than the idea. She planted the south garden bed with the extra compost Ura had prescribed and watched the cabbages and turnips and onions come up with a proprietary satisfaction that was new to her and entirely enjoyable. She found in the back acreage a stand of wild herbs that had been there long enough to suggest they had been planted by someone years ago, chamomile and yarrow, and something she did not recognize until she tasted a leaf and identified it as a northern variant of a plant her grandmother had used, which felt like a small gift from a world that did not always give them. She traded herbs at the Duskwall market. That was the first time she went into town in June, when the summer warmth made everything feel more manageable, and Simon came with her, and stood beside her at the market stall, with the easy, unconcerned presence of a man who had decided what was right, and did not feel the need to defend the decision to anyone. The market was a broad, unpaved square surrounded by timber-framed buildings, loud with voices and wagon wheels, and the smell of animal and wood smoke and fresh bread from the baker's stall. People looked, people always looked. Some of them looked and looked away. Some of them looked and their expressions did the complicated thing. A few did not look away and let their expressions stay complicated loudly enough to be a statement. Glasha kept her chin up. Simon kept his shoulder next to hers. A woman named Hesta Morn, who ran the herb stall adjacent to the space Glasha had set up in, leaned over and examined her chamomile bundles with a professional squint and said, "Where did you dry these?" "Barn loft, with the door open to the west," Glasha said. "Good air flow. They have kept their color." Hesta looked at her directly, without the performance of someone performing fairness, just with the natural directness of a woman who cared about herbs and found other things secondary. "What else have you got?" Glasha sold everything she had brought. Hesta bought half of it herself. On the walk back to the wagon, Simon said quietly, "That went well." "Better than expected," Glasha agreed. "Hesta Morn is the most respected vendor in the market," he said. "The fact that she bought from you will matter to the others." "You knew that," she said. "You knew which stall to set up next to." He did not reply immediately. Then, "I may have spoken to Hesta last week when I came for supplies." Glasha stopped walking and looked at him. He was watching the middle distance with the innocent expression of a man who had planned something considerate and was being caught at it. "You spoke to her," Glasha said. "Before we came. I may have mentioned that a woman with considerable knowledge of ridge country medicinals would be bringing samples to the market. You solicited a customer for me. I indicated an opportunity to a businesswoman," he said. She studied him for another moment. He met her eyes with the gray-eyed steadiness that she had never once in 8 months seen crack into something dishonest. She took his arm, tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow, and they walked back to the wagon. Torvin Stout, sitting outside the general store with 2 other men, watched them pass. She saw him. She held Simon's arm and looked ahead and walked like a woman who had every right to be exactly where she was, because she did. Word came from Ura in August, through the northern trader. The letter was brief and in Ashwalker, written in Ura's precise hand on a piece of paper that had been folded 4 times and had seen considerable travel. It said that Bograth was alive and healing, that 8 of the 11 others were recovering well, that the Ashwalkers who had survived the raid were beginning to talk about a permanent camp in the high country, a new thing, built differently than the last one, that she was staying for now because she was needed, but she was well, that the northern mountains were cold even in summer, which she had expected. The last line said, in Ashwalker, "Tell my niece I know what I said and I was right." Glasha read this line twice and folded the letter carefully and did not tell Simon what the last line said, because she already knew Ura was right. In September, almost exactly 1 year after Glasha had come down the ridge into Simon's yard, Garrett Solis came back. He came alone this time, and without papers, And he came at a Sunday hour when the light was long and amber and the yard was quiet. Glasha was sitting on the cabin step sorting seeds for the winter store, and Simon was just inside with the door open. She looked up and saw Solly's on his horse at the edge of the yard. He did not dismount immediately. He looked at her for a moment, a long, assessing look that was different from the official looks he had given before, less calculated and more simply evaluating. "Miss Ashwalker," he said. "Mr. Solly's," she said. Simon appeared in the doorway. Solly's looked at him, then back at her. "The garrison has received notice from the Territorial Assembly," he said. "The relocation statutes for non-citizen persons on deeded property have been formally reviewed. The Assembly has found, in majority, that resident designation by a property holder supersedes territorial relocation authority." He paused. "You and your aunt are formally recognized as residents of the Hawkins property." "I know," Simon said from the doorway. "I received the same notice 3 weeks ago." Solly's nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet he looked like a man revising something. "I have it," he paused, "a recommendation from the inquiry process. Unofficial." He looked at Glasha. "The Ashwalkers in the high country, the ones under Bograth. They are technically in violation of the territorial settlement provisions, being unregistered and undesignated." "I am aware of the provisions," Glasha said carefully. "If they were to come down from the high country," Solly said, picking his words as though he were laying stones across a ford, "and if a property holder of appropriate standing were to file designations of residents, multiple ones, if they distributed across the settled properties in the area, then the garrison would have no legal standing to pursue relocation." He looked at his horse's ears. "The legal instrument Hawkins found, through his correspondence, has already been cited in 2 other cases this season. The garrison's legal standing on these matters is considerably narrower than it was." Glasha looked at him for a long time. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He looked at her directly. His face had the quality of a man who had spent some time with a thing and was still not fully comfortable with it, but had decided to say it anyway. "Because what happened to your clan at that camp was beyond what I would have sanctioned," he said. "I was not there, and if I had been, I would have—" He stopped. "It is not enough to say it now. I know that. But the law as I understand it now is different from how it was applied then, and I intend to apply it differently going forward." He tipped his hat. "Good day." He rode away, and this time Glasha watched him go with a different quality of watching, not relief or triumph, but something more complicated, the recognition that the world could sometimes, slowly, turn in a slightly better direction. Simon came to stand beside her on the step. "He is trying," Simon said. "He is trying," she agreed. She looked at the seeds in her hands. "We need to write to Ura." "I will get paper," he said. They wrote the letter together, her dictating the Ashwalker text and him providing the practical details of the legal instrument and the process by which the designation filings could work. The letter went north with the October mail. Ura's response came in November. She would bring Bograth down in the spring. The other Ashwalkers would come in groups gradually as the legal filings could accommodate them. It was not a solution. It was a beginning, which was how most good things started. On the 1st of December, Simon came inside from the barn in the early dark with snow on his hat and sat down across from Glasha at the table where she was mending a strap on her boot by firelight, and he said, "I have been thinking." She set down the strap. "All right." "I have been thinking about—" He paused, which was unusual for him because he did not usually pause, because he thought before he spoke and generally knew what he intended to say by the time he said it, "about whether there is a formal expression in Ashwalker tradition for what we are to each other." She looked at him. "You explained the beginning of it," he said. "The words that start it. I have been thinking about whether there is a completion of it, a formal thing." He met her eyes. "Because if there is, I would like to know what it is and do it correctly." Glasha set the boot down on the table. "There is," she said. "It is called the Ash Walk. It is done on a significant day, a solstice or an equinox, usually in view of witnesses if any are available. Both people make a fire together and walk through the smoke of it and take each other's hands and speak their intentions. "What are the words?" he said. "The words are whatever is true," she said. "They are different for everyone. The tradition is not in the specific words but in the speaking of them truthfully in the smoke." He nodded slowly. "The winter solstice is in 3 weeks." "It is," she said. "Yura is not here to witness," he said. "No," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "There is a family north of here, the Carvers. Aldous he is not my closest friend, but his wife Anna has been quietly kind. She came to the market in August and bought from your stall." He paused. "I think if I asked, she would come." "You have been thinking about witnesses," Glasha said. "I have been thinking about this for some time," he said simply. She looked at this man, this lean, gray-eyed, unhurried, deeply certain man who had given her his yard and his fire and his legal counsel and his patience and his heart, who had stood in front of mounted authority and said, "Not this one, not today, not on my land." And she felt the love she had for him as a physical thing, as real and heavy and warm as the fire behind her. "Ask Anna Carver," she said, "and I will write to Yura so she can be told even if she cannot be here." "All right," he said. He looked at her hands and then at her face, and then he smiled, the full smile, the one that changed everything about him, and she reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. On the winter solstice, they made the fire in the yard. It was a clear night with the cold, so pure it felt like a physical substance, and the stars so numerous and close that the sky looked crowded. Anna Carver stood at the edge of the yard, wrapped in her good wool coat with her husband beside her, and Aldous Carver had the look of a man who was not entirely sure what he was witnessing, but had decided to be respectful about it. Glasha wore her travel leathers still, the fitted bodice laced over the linen shirt, her braid pulled back with the green ribbon, her boots with their worn heels. She had cleaned everything carefully, and she wore her clan tattoos as the only decoration she needed, because they were her people and her history, and she would not diminish them even here, even tonight, even in a yard full of humans. Simon wore his good coat and his clean hat and had shaved, which told her he was taking this with the full seriousness he brought to things that mattered. They built the fire together. She placed the wood. He set the fire with the flint, and it caught quickly and rose up clear and bright in the still cold air. The smoke went straight up into the dark. They walked through it together, facing each other, the smoke between them and then around them, and she breathed it in pine and birch and wood smoke, the smell of everything they had built this year, and she held his hands. She spoke first. "I walked into your yard 12 months ago with nothing," she said, and her voice was steady and clear in the cold. "I had lost my people and my home, and I was cold, and I did not expect anything from you because the world had given me no reason to expect kindness from a stranger. You gave me warmth and food and space to breathe, and you asked nothing of me except the splitting of wood, which I offered." She looked at him through the smoke, through the firelight. "You have stood between me and every force that would have taken my safety from me, and you have done it with a calmness that I have come to understand is not calmness at all but conviction. You smell like safety to me, Simon Hawkins, now and for all the time ahead of this. You carry my peace. I will walk in the ash of this fire with you for as long as walking is possible." He was very still when she finished. The firelight was doing things to his face that made him look like something from a very old story, not pretty, not romantic in a theatrical sense, but real and deep and completely present. "I was alone for a long time before you came into my yard," he said. His voice was low, and the cold was crisp, and she heard every word as though it were the only word. Not alone in the difficult way, but in the way of a house that has the right structure but nothing inside it that means anything. I did not know what was missing until it arrived. You arrived. He held her hands more tightly. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and I do not say that as a compliment to your exceptional skill at hunting or your knowledge of every plant on this ridge, though both of those things are genuinely impressive. I say it because of the quality of your heart, The way you hold your dignity in a world that does not make it easy, the way you care for the people who are yours, the way you have let me be one of those people." He paused. "You carry my peace. You have from the first day. I will stand in this smoke with you for the rest of my life, and I will consider it the best use of a life I can imagine." Anak Carver made a small sound that might have been a breath or might have been a sob, efficiently muffled. They walked through the smoke together once, twice, 3 times as was tradition, and then they were on the same side of the fire and he pulled her in and kissed her in the light of it, and the stars were very close, and the cold was nothing. Bograth came down from the mountains in April with 12 Ashwalkers, as promised, and they were thin and winter-worn but alive and carrying themselves with the dignity of people who had survived something considerable. Glasha and Ura met them at the northern tree line, where the wagon track widened out, and when Bograth saw Glasha, he made the elder sound, the deep, gravel sound of approval and recognition, and gripped her forearms in the traditional greeting, and she gripped his back. He was old and his hair was white, and he had a new scar through his chin from whatever had happened at the camp, but his eyes were the same, dark and deep and very much present. "You are well," he said. "I am very well," she said. He looked past her at Simon, who stood at the wagon with Ura. "That is the man," Bograth said. "That is Simon Hawkins," Glasha said. Bograth studied him for a long moment. Simon met the look with his usual steadiness. "He stood his ground," Bograth said. "It was not a question. Ura would have told him everything." "He stood his ground," Glasha confirmed. Bograth walked toward Simon and Simon went to meet him, and the elder gripped his forearms and Simon, who did not know this greeting but recognized a gesture of respect, gripped back. "You gave our daughter safety," Bograth said. "The clan remembers." Simon looked at Glasha, who was smiling despite herself. "She gave me considerably more in return," Simon said. The designation filings worked, across the spring, through a combination of Simon's contacts and Anak Carver's surprising willingness to stand at the filing office and state clearly that her property had room for 2 additional residents, which was more than Glasha had expected from Aldous Carver's wife, but apparently less than Anak Carver felt was sufficient, because she organized 3 other property holders to file similar designations before the summer was out. The territory did not become welcoming overnight. That was not the nature of the territory, but it became navigable, which was different and in its own way significant. The Ashwalkers who settled into the patchwork of designated residences across the area found work, and found tolerance of the grudging kind that was the first step toward something warmer, and Bograth held a council in the Pine Flats that Glasha attended and reported back from, and the council determined that survival was a victory worth naming, and named it. Garrett Solis filed a report to the garrison that fall that Glasha was never officially shown, but that Simon, through his legal contact, described the Ashwalker situation in the territory as stable and no longer requiring active intervention. It was a small and bureaucratic thing, and it was not justice, but it was peace of a kind. And peace of a kind, Glasha had learned from her grandmother, was how you built the permanent kind. 2 years after the first winter, Glasha stood in the kitchen garden in the afternoon light of a September, and the garden was substantially larger than the one she had found when she arrived, because they had extended it in both directions in the spring, and she had applied everything she knew about ridge country soil to the task. The cabbages were the size of a man's head. The chamomile was a whole separate bed now, because the Duskwall market had made it worth growing seriously. She was aware of a quality of contentment so complete and specific that she paused to acknowledge it, standing between the cabbage rows with her hands in the soil, looking at the homestead around her, the cabin with its improved roof, the barn with the repaired foundation corner, the woodpile for the coming winter already built to a serious height, the lantern post near the barn that Simon lit every evening now with a regularity that she had come to think of as a kind of love language. She was aware also of something new, something that had been accumulating for 2 weeks and that she had been examining with increasing certainty. She went inside. Simon was at the work table writing a letter, another legal one, related to a challenge one of the Ashwalker families had faced in the northern settlement from a property dispute. He looked up when she came in. She sat across from him. He put the pen down. "Tell me," he said. "I believe," she said carefully, "that I am carrying." The silence was the specific kind that fills with something expanding. He looked at her. His gray eyes went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, which was brief, and then something that was not surprise at all, which told her he had perhaps been thinking about this possibility in the same way she had been, and then they settled on something warm and open and very certain. "Are you?" he started. "I am well," she said. "I feel well. It is early, but I am certain of it." "How early?" 6, perhaps 7 weeks. He came around the table. He did not say anything for a moment, just stood in front of her with his hands at his sides, and his expression doing everything his voice was not yet doing. She stood up. He put his hands on her face, both hands, cupping her jaw the way he had that first night they had found each other, careful and warm, and he pressed his forehead to hers, and she felt him breathe. "We will need to extend the cabin," he said, against her temple. She laughed, sudden and real. "Eventually," she said. "We have time." "We have a great deal to do," he said, but his voice was the warmest she had ever heard it, the warmth that lived below all his level, careful speech, the warmth that was the actual interior of Simon Hawkins. "We have time," she said again, and meant it about all of it, the cabin and the spring planting and the legal letters and the growing Ashwalker community on the ridge and the life that was spreading out ahead of them like a valley seen from a high place, deep and broad, and full of everything still to come. They built the extension in the spring. Simon and 2 of the Ashwalker men who had moved into the northern properties and had become, gradually, and with the particular care of men who did not perform friendships but built them, something in the way of friends. The extension added a second room and a proper window on the south side that Glasha had insisted on, because light mattered, and in the south room they set a new bed and a small chest that Simon had made through the winter evenings out of pine planks and quiet care. Yura came down from the mountains in May to be present for the birth, which she said was not negotiable, and nobody argued with her. The child came in June at dusk, when the light through the new south window was the color of honey. A boy, born with the green tinge of his mother's skin warming quickly to a deep olive, with his father's dark hair and the small soft abundance of new hair, and the very particular gray-green eyes that were a combination of both his parents in a way that made Yura, who had seen many births and made a practice of not being surprised by anything, make the satisfied sound of someone witnessing something unprecedented and excellent. Simon held his son for the first time sitting on the edge of the new bed in the south room, with Glasha beside him and the June evening coming in through the south window and the smell of wood smoke and chamomile and new life in the room, and his face was the face of a man who had arrived somewhere he had not known he was traveling toward. "He needs a name," he said. "He does," Glasha agreed. She was tired and warm and more quietly, solidly happy than she had known was possible. "What do you want to call him?" Simon looked at the small, sleeping face in his hands. "In your tradition," he said, "is there a naming practice?" "The name comes from the quality most visible in the child at birth," she said, "but we can use both a human name and an Ashwalker name." "Then you choose the Ashwalker name," he said, "and I will choose the other." She looked at her son, at the stillness of him, the deep, certain sleep of a creature who had arrived in safety and knew it already. "Sarak," she said. "It means one who finds the still place." "Sarak," Simon repeated, with the care he always gave to things he was learning. And he paused. "My grandfather's name was Edmund. Good name, solid." "Edmund Sarak Hawkins," Glasha said. "Or Sarak Edmund Hawkins," Simon offered. "If you would prefer his Ashwalker name to come first." She looked at him. She looked at this man who thought to offer that, who always thought to offer the thing that said, "I consider your tradition equal to mine." "Edmund Sarak," she said. "Edmund first. He will live in both worlds, and I want the world that already holds power to have to speak his other name to know him fully." Simon smiled the full smile. "Edmund Sarek Hawkins," he said. "Hello." Bograth came to the homestead 3 days after the birth, bringing with him the Ashwalk gift, a tradition in which the eldest of the clan gave the new child a token of the land, a small piece of the ridge stone, smooth and dark, from the mountains where the clan had been reborn. He pressed it into Glasha's hand without ceremony, the way he did all serious things. "The child carries both bloods," Bograth said. He looked at Simon without the assessment anymore, just the recognition. "He will be able to go where neither of you can go alone. That is what we are hoping for," Simon said. By the time Edmund Sarek was walking, the territory had shifted in the particular incremental way that territories shift, not by decree and not by dramatic change, but by accumulated small facts. The Ashwalker families on the ridge had been there for 2 years, and they worked hard and paid their way and caused no trouble, and the trouble that had been caused to them was not forgotten, but was becoming the kind of thing that was known rather than current, which was progress. Torvin Stout had left the territory for a posting farther south, which no one mourned. Hesta mourn at the Duskwall market had become, by degrees and the logic of commerce and mutual respect, something that Glasha might cautiously call a friend. Garrett Sollies, when he came to Duskwall, had twice now nodded to Glasha in the market with the nod of a man who was revising something about himself, slowly and at some personal cost, which was the most she expected of him and more than she had. Anna Carver came to tea occasionally, which had started as a surprise and become comfortable, and her children played in the homestead yard with a total absence of the hesitation that their parents carried, which was as good an argument for the future as any Glasha had ever heard. On the 3rd anniversary of the Ashwalk, Simon and Glasha stood in the yard at dusk while Edmund Sarek, who was 6 months old and had opinions about everything, slept in the south room, and the lantern was lit at the post near the barn, and the sky was going down in colors that Glasha had no word for in either language, just the quality of them deep and honest and very wide. 3 years, Simon said. 3 years, she agreed. "You walked into my yard with nothing," he said. "And you gave me biscuits," she said. "Salt pork," he clarified. "Biscuits," she said firmly. "And coffee." He laughed and she laughed with him, and the evening held them both in the good light. She thought about everything that had happened since that gray morning when she had come down the ridge and found this man at his woodpile, and she thought about the word safety. What it had meant then, when she was cold and hungry and alone, and what it meant now, when it was a life built in a specific place with specific hands and a specific person, when it was a child sleeping in the south room and an aunt in the mountains and an elder who had lived and a community still becoming. When it was this man's shoulder and this man's hands and the quality that she had recognized before she had words for what she was recognizing. "You still smell like safety," she said. He turned to look at her and his eyes were gray and warm in the lantern light. "And you still carry my peace," he said. "All of it, every piece of it." She leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the yard of the homestead that was theirs, watching the sky go all the way to dark, while the lantern kept its particular promise against it, and the smoke from the chimney went straight up into the clear September night, and the ridge stood in its permanent silence behind the pines, and the valley below was full of the ordinary, extraordinary fact of a life being lived in full. In the morning there would be work, always there would be work, the honest, good work of the land and the season and the small community growing around them. There would be letters to write and gardens to tend, and a child who would, very soon, begin to discover that the world was wider than the yard. There would be difficulty and beauty in equal measure, the way the territory offered both, the way all of life offered both. But tonight there was the lantern and the stars and the warmth of 2 people standing in a yard they had built together, listening to the particular silence of a place that was home. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, as Yura had said, not a small thing at all.